Hello, my name is Jason Johnson, and thank you for watching. I hope you find my videos helpful, and thank you for subscribing to my channel. If you have any questions or feedback for me, you can leave a comment below, and I'll answer as quick as possible, or I'll try to point you in the right direction. This video is going to be over Chapter 3, Part 2 for the NetAcad IT Essentials. And again, this is Chapter 3, Part 2 of 3. Part 2 of 3, and the links to parts 1 and 3 should be in the description below on the video. So in this video, we're going to look at the BIOS and the boot up of a computer. So in the previous video, we looked at assembling the computer, the case, putting the motherboard in, putting everything in, and booting it up. This video, we're going to look at what happens next. So when we boot a computer up, if everything was connected properly, and all of the components are working properly, so we'll qualify the information with that. So as long as everything's working properly, you should get a boot up. And so you should see a BIOS screen, and we'll look at an example of that here in just a minute. And you should get a BIOS or a basic, when we get this booted, and that BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System. And the BIOS is going to provide some beep codes if you don't have certain things plugged in properly, or if something's missing. For example, if it can't find a hard drive, or if it can't find if the RAM's not seated properly on the motherboard, you'll get a certain type of beep codes. And the beep codes do mean something, so you should consult the BIOS manual or the manufacturer, whoever the BIOS is for, the motherboard manufacturer, and understand what those beep codes mean. So as that computer boots up, it's going to check all the critical components. It's going to do a post test. The firmware that's built in on the motherboard is going to either be BIOS or UEFI, and it's going to use beep codes to indicate any errors. And critical components such as video card, memory, and I/O devices are going to be checked. And then a post card can be used to help debug a post problem, by the way. So if you're having problems, there are cards that you can plug into your motherboard to find out what's going on if you need to get to that. I've never used one in my career, but I do know when you elevate that to the next level to find out what's going on, you can do that. So you find out what the problems are. You might want to check the BIOS firmware and find out the date of that and find out if it needs to be updated. And you might just go ahead and update that before you do any operating system or anything else, because sometimes that can eliminate any problems that you might have. So motherboards need firmware to operate, and they have that built in, but there are also updates to that. So some BIOS... some aspects of the BIOS can be updated, or some things can be changed on there, and then settings are then stored, or the settings from the BIOS are then stored in the CMOS, which is written on the motherboard, which it gets saved. That does not disappear when the computer reboots, but that gets saved, and it's a little bit more permanent. And I'm on this next screen, I'm going to show you an example of a BIOS here. And you usually just use your mouse, or excuse me, your keyboard to move around. You don't have mouse features with most BIOS. Some of the newer ones do have some mouse functions with the BIOS, but for the most part, they're still just keyboard driven. So you have to move around with your keyboard, and you just in different BIOSes have different features depending on the motherboard, and so you just need to consult with the BIOS manufacturer and the motherboard manufacturer to find out what features your motherboard has for the BIOS. Now, the BIOS setup program does allow you to change the settings. It allows you to change some settings in there, set a password for the boot up, some things like that. It can be accessed by moving around with the keys or a combination of keys, but you want to, again, refer to the motherboard documentation on that. When you get to the UEFI setup, it's also built into the firmware. It also performs some of the same task as the BIOS, and it eventually will make the BIOS obsolete. Eventually, a UEFI will be on all motherboards, and BIOS will go away. But it can also be accessed by pressing a proper key or combination during the startup, sometimes F10 or Shift F10 or F2 or F8. It really just is going to depend on the motherboard which key combination you have to press. And you want to refer to that documentation to find out which one is going to be the proper key combination. Now, with the BIOS information, it provide information about installed hardware, including the CPU and the RAM and the hard drives and your optical drives, and that's helpful for when you're trying to troubleshoot something that's going on or something that's not working properly. And so when you go into your BIOS configure, you want to change things around that are going to be set properly for you. You can set make settings improper. So you can do incorrect settings, and they can have an adverse effect on your equipment. So you want to be careful about when you're making changes and updating things. Maybe starting doing overclocking. Make sure that you have proper cooling and things like that. So just know what you're doing before you change settings on your BIOS. Consult the manufacturer manual and just make sure that you know what you're doing before you do that. Now here's another example of a BIOS setting here down at the bottom right-hand corner. And there's some security on the BIOS. It includes a feature to protect the BIOS settings. Common security features, you can have a BIOS password, you can do drive encryption, you can put LoJack software on there, do a trusted platform module, and you can also do secure boot. Back 10, 15 years ago with the BIOS passwords, you could just open up the case, change a jumper, and reset the password on the BIOS, and you could just bypass the password that way and that easily. So we've come up with some different things now that you either do drive encryption or do LoJack that can track the computer when it's turned on, or do trusted platform module. And we're not going to discuss that in this video, but those can be discussed in another time, or you can ask your instructor about that in your course. Now, the BIOS hardware diagnostic and monitoring is also, you can look at the temperature. There's some other monitoring that some BIOSes provide, temperature, fan speeds, clock speeds, bus speeds, intrusion detection. Some servers that I've used in the past, if the case had been opened up, the BIOS will give you a warning and say, there wasn't a previous attempt or a previous time the case was opened on this. So it lets you know that somebody was inside that hardware, which is a nice feature. Now, the UEFI EZ mode on newer computers, it is replacing the BIOS, and it's UEFI firmware, and that does provide more security features, and it has some new features that BIOS had some shortcomings on it, so the UEFI does change that. It's got a new GUI, or graphical user interface. It provides some better information. It gives you an overview of basic system information. And then when you go into advanced mode, that gets you into more of the involved features like AI tweaker or monitoring and booting, maybe overclocking. And with that, I would again just caution you to make sure you understand what you're doing before you make changes. Okay, so this was part 2 of the chapter. This was part 2 of chapter 3 on computer assembly, and we looked at the BIOS and the UEFI configuration. I hope this video was helpful, and I hope you have a great day.